Hi, today we're going to go over the build of an Eggtimer Quark dual deployment computer. This is one of Eggtimer's more simple computers. It is a fully dual deploy computer that provides drogue and main chute deployment and can be used as a backup. You can set it so the drogue comes out about a second later than apogee, so you can use it as a backup. It's not that hard to put together. This is a great little unit, very small, fits in a lot of rockets. This is my setup. It's an Hakko FX972 setup that I use for soldering. You don't need this kind of soldering station for a Quark, but it definitely helps to have some smaller tips. I use a 0.3 millimeter tip on mine because some of the components on the Quark are very small. It's still a relatively easy unit to put together, but there are some surface-mounted chips that aren't that big. So definitely have a tip that can handle that. So let's open up our package here. We're going to pull everything out and do a physical inventory of all of the components that come in the kit. I like to actually physically check off your checklist for each part because one, it makes sure you have everything in there. And you have, there's nothing missing, but also it lets you get familiar with the parts before you start your build, so that when you actually are going through the build, you don't screw anything up and put the wrong component in the wrong place. So take everything out of your packaging, out of the anti-static packaging, you put it on your work surface, and let's get inventorying here. The first component you're going to inventory is the PCB itself. This is what you're going to solder all the parts to. Put that to the side. The next component up is the processor chip. It's a 14-pin chip. This is what it looks like. It's the only large chip in the package. And don't forget to check off your list as you go. The next up is a voltage regulator. This is a pretty common piece on Eggtimer builds, a 3.3 volt voltage regulator. Next up, you've got your driver chips. There's 2 of them, and they're 8-pin chips packaged together. All right, the next chip up is a rectifier. It's this very small 2-pin type of chip. And put that to the side. And then we're going to go through our resistors. So first up are some 4.7K resistors. These are marked 472. You get 3 of them. You're going to need 2. Next up, you've got some 10K resistors. They're marked 103. You're going to need 1 of these, and you get 2. Last up on the resistors, you get some 100K resistors. These are marked 104. You need 2 of them, and you get 3. All right, now we've got the capacitors. You have to be really careful with these because they look exactly the same between the 2 types. These are the 0.1 UF, and they're in the paper carrier. This is what it means by paper carrier. This white paper carrier with the plastic coating on it. Don't mix them up with the other ones. You've got 2 of these. You've got 3 of these, and you need 2. So you have one way to tell is you got an extra one for the small ones. Now these are the 10 UF ones, totally in a plastic clear carrier. There's no white carrier here, and you only get 2 of these. So don't drop one of these. They're very hard to find if you drop one on the floor, and don't mess them up with the 0.1 UF. We'll go over that a little bit more during the build. You got a pretty standard buzzer here. It is polarized. There's a positive and negative lead, and we'll make sure we identify that when we put it on the board. You got some header strips here. You got a 2-row 3-pin header strip and a 1-row 3-pin header strip. And then you get about a bunch of shorting jumpers. You get 3 of them here. This is how you're going to control the board itself. So don't lose those. You're going to need them. And finally, a terminal block to attach your wiring. You also get some soldering wire from Eggtimer. This is really good Kester no clean soldering wire. Highly recommend use this unless you have something that's equivalent. I use Kester soldering wire off a large roll, so I won't use this, but definitely use that stuff. It's good. We're going to do the Rev D3 version of the Quark here. This was the most recent one as of January 2025. Okay, the first component we're going to put on the board is this 100K resistor. It's marked 104. It goes in that spot right at the top of the board, conveniently marked 104. So the trick to putting these surface-mounted chips in is to tin one pad on the board. So use your soldering iron to heat up one pad and just put a little soldering on there. And while keeping that solder hot, take your tweezers and move the chip into place. And the trick is to get it in there while the solder is still flowing, and to try to center that chip both between the two pads and make sure it's not overlapping too much. Then you just heat up the other side and put a nice little tent of solder, not too much so it bridges underneath and not too little so it's not tacked in place. Just make a good connection. Next up, we're going to put these driver chips in. Now, when you look at the chip, it's got a bevel on one side. That bevel goes towards that little box. The other way to kind of know how it's going is that lettering has to be facing towards the center of the board. And similarly to the resistor chip, just heat up one of these little pads and then center the chip while you're keeping the solder hot so that it's all 8 pins are centered on those little pads. It's a little tough to get it in place, but the trick is to get it completely centered, just like that. Once you have it centered, go ahead and you're going to solder each pin in place. This is the same as you just want a little, so be careful there, like you can see it move. A nice little tent of solder that is shiny and doesn't bridge like that. And you want to avoid that. Now, that was not a great solder. See how it keeps bridging? I probably have my iron just a little too hot there. But at the end, it should look like that. No bridges between the pins and nice little shiny tents of solder that get up underneath the pin, but don't bridge and don't go up on the chip itself. Once you're done, it looks like that. And then before we put the other driver chip in, put this other 100K resistor. We'll do this in normal speed. We'll start speeding these up so you don't have to keep watching them because there's a lot of surface mounted chips, but we'll do another one in regular speed here. Tin the pad, center your chip on the two pads, let it cool. And if it doesn't get in place, just keep moving it around till you get it in there. There you go. Now solder one side, again, a nice shiny tent. It gets up under the chip and on top of it, but not bridging underneath. Okay, now we'll get the other driver chip in. Again, the bevel side goes towards that pin 1, that little square box inside the silkscreen box on the board. So tin one of the pin pads, move your chip into place while keeping the solder on the pad flowing or warm. And in this case, I kind of got a little solder on the second pad, so it was a little tougher for me. But once I heated up both of them at the same time, it got in place. I'm a little off there. So once again, you can just reheat and move your chip into place. You don't have to, you can move it as many times as you want right now before you start soldering pins in. And now it's nice and centered. And again, just go around and solder each pin in with a nice shiny tent of solder that doesn't bridge any of the other pins or underneath the chip and doesn't touch the chip, but gives you good contact from the pin to the pad on the board. And as you can tell, I'm having some big problems today. So if this happens, just go ahead and take a soldering wick and get rid of the solder. It's as easy as that. It takes a second or two to get rid of it. Now just go back through and solder your pins a little more neatly. And in this case, I probably should have been cleaning up my tip a lot more. And I'd switch to a smaller tip here. So my 0.3 was definitely too big for these pins, in my opinion. I switched to a much more narrow tip and had a lot better success. So in this particular case, I did, as I noted at the beginning, this board has a lot of small components. You might want to see if you can find a soldering iron with a smaller tip. These larger tips are a little bit tough to manage on a tight board like this. But once I switched over to this smaller tip, everything worked out much neater, and I had no problems with the bridging anymore. So it's up to you, but one of the nice things about having a soldering station like this is the ability to switch tips quickly. All right, the next component up is this large processor chip, 14 pins. Now you see that dot on the end. That has to line up with that notch on the silk screen. That's pin 1. You definitely, as with all of these components, make sure they're in the right orientation or the board will not work at the end. But you can see I'm sticking with the smaller tip for here with these tight pins. But again, similar as the driver chips, just tin one of the pads. Get the processor chip in place, centered on all 14 pads. This was a little tougher, but not too bad. You can kind of hold it in place with your soldering iron there and then let it cool. And there you go, nice and centered. Now, simply do exactly like you did with the driver chip and just go around and solder each pin in around the board. Now that you have a couple of pins in, I like to get those corners done on these large chips, and then you're nice and solid. It's not going to move anymore. Now, a simple matter of going around and soldering each pin around the processor chip. And we will move the board around. Again, having a vise is really a great feature on your soldering station setup because you can move these boards around, and when you tape them down to your work surface, it's a lot harder to work. I highly recommend a pan of vise if you're going to be doing any sort of soldering, or you're going to be building Eggtimer boards or anything, any soldering. It really helps out. So once you're done with that, we're going to move on to these 0.1 UF capacitors. Again, make sure you're using the right one here. They look exactly the same, but these are the ones in the white paper carrier, but these are put in exactly like the resistors. You're just going to tin one pad, move the capacitor into place, centered between the two pads, and let it cool. They're a little bit, so the 0.1 UF are a little bit smaller than the 10 UF. It's one way to tell it. Now this is tough. In retrospect, I almost think I would put this 0.1 UF in before the processor. It was very difficult to move it, but it's up to you. But see, it's hard to solder this one in with the processor chip right there, not bridge those. This is definitely where I like having that smaller tip available. All right, we're gonna keep going with the resistors here. This is a 10K marked 103, another one right next to the processor chip. So be careful, kind of tough to get these in and not bridge, but you have to make sure you don't bridge that right pad over to the processor chip. So again, a spot where these smaller tipped irons are very useful on a board like this. But once you have this one put in place, we'll move on. Next up, this is another one of the 0.1 UF, and it's right next to that 103. Again, these come in the white paper carrier. So we'll start speeding this up now. There's no reason to watch through these in real time because there's a lot, these surface mounted chips are all the same. Next up, we have these 4.7Ks down near the bottom of the board. Tack them in place, and solder them in securely. There we go. Next up, we've got these 10 UF. These are in the plastic carrier, the clear plastic carrier. They're slightly bigger than the 0.1 UF, and there's two of them. There's one over there by the 4.7Ks and one right next to that 0.1 UF. But they're put in exactly the same way. Tin a pad, tack them in place, turn your workpiece, and solder them in securely. Ooh, and that's what happens when you tombstone one, because I put it on the wrong side. And I kept this in here because it's a good example of when you mess this up, no worries. Just tack it back in place. It's no big deal. And go again. So, you don't have to be concerned. Now, you notice I switched back over to my larger tipped soldering iron. I felt that the components from here on out weren't so small as those small pins on the driver and processor chip. So this is the voltage regulator, and you see that big pad on one side. You tin that one and put that big pin in place. Slide this into place, and heat that up and get a nice bit of solder under there to not only hold it in place, but also it provides like a nice connection. There's a lot of voltage going through here. Now each one of these pins are soldered the same way as the processor and driver chips, but you have to wait 30 seconds between each one. I sped it up in the video and cut that 30 seconds out, but you have to make sure you wait 30 seconds between all 4 of these pins. Once you're done with the small pins, get a really good chunk of solder on the big one. All right, here we go with this rectifier, and that white line is away from that triangle, at the point of the triangle. So make sure, once again, you have this oriented properly or the board won't work. But other than that, it goes in just like all of the other surface mounted components that are similar to it, like the resistors and capacitors. Tin a pad, slide it into place, turn it around, and solder it in securely. Okay, once we've got that rectifier soldered in, we're going to move on to the buzzer. Now notice it's got a plus sign on one side that has to line up with the plus sign on the board, but also the other way you can tell is the positive side has a longer pin. Now make sure all of your other components are good, because this buzzer sits on top of the processor and the capacitors. So once you put this in, you can't really mess with those anymore. So make sure you inspect all of your joints prior to putting the buzzer in. But if you're comfortable with it, tape the buzzer down and then just go to the other side and solder the pins in. Then clip off that long pin and make sure you control the cutoff so it doesn't go flying into your face. Next up, you've got this 2-row, 3-pin header block that goes right there next to the chip. Just put the tape right through the headers. I just put all the headers in at once, the 2 rows and the single row right next to it. So you've got all 9 of these pins, and they are just standard through-hole pins to solder here. So we'll do a couple and then speed up the video. Okay, once you get all those pins soldered in, we're going to do the terminal block. Now make sure that the large openings point to the outside of the board, because that's where you put the wires in. If you turn it around, it's going to be a lot harder to get those wires screwed in each time you want to do it. So just place it in the board and tape it down. Pretty simple. Turn it over and you'll see all 4 pins sticking out the other side. And just like all the other through-hole components, just solder those with a nice little tent of solder. Make sure it's nice and shiny and not cold soldered. All right, now we're going to use a battery connector. I'm using a JST connector, so use whatever connector for the battery you want to use, but since I'm going to be using 2S LiPos, make sure you check the polarity on the batteries you're using and the connectors, and that you put them in properly. Once you know which the polarity is, in my case, I'm just using a wired JST connector, so I put the positive wire, the red one, through the positive hole, hold it in place with some helping hands here, and then once it's in place and held securely, I just solder it in just like any other through-hole component. There you go, nice shiny tint. Negative wire, same way. Use some helping hands, hold it in place, and solder it securely. So now that we've got that done, that's pretty much it. This board's pretty simple. We're going to test it by just hooking up a 2S LiPo battery to it. And what we should get is a series of beeps. And if we get the right beep pattern, then we know we've done it properly. Okay, we know we've got the beeps properly done, so now let's go through what the configurations look like for each of the flight modes. If you have no jumpers on at all, it's just regular drogue. It's going to come out at apogee and may come out. If you put the jumper on the 1 second drogue, it's a 1 second delay, so that's when you'd use it as a backup. No regular drogue main coming out at 300 feet is the jumper on the 300, 500 set of pins. None at all means it's a regular apogee deployment for the drogue, and the main will come out at 500 feet. A jumper on the 3500 and the plus 500 gets you a main at 800 feet, drogue at apogee. And then a jumper way out on the end on the plus 500 gets you a drogue apogee, and the main will come out at 1,000 feet. And now you can combine these. In this case, the main was coming out at 300 feet with a jumper on the 3.5 and a 1 second delay. So this is exactly how you'd probably want to set things up as a backup because the main would come out low. All right, that's it. Pretty simple build, pretty quick, but this is a really cool, low-cost, functional dual deployment computer from Eggtimer. I really like to use these, especially since they're small. They fit in a lot of smaller rockets, and it's very, very reliable. These are one of these rockets that you just can't components you can't mess up. Really, there's nothing to set on a computer. There's no Wi-Fi. You just set the jumpers, hook up the battery, put your deployment wires on, and you're ready to go. If you have any questions, put them down in the comments, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Good luck and thanks.